Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth of the book discussions which we've organized this year under the auspices of the Global Educational Outreach Program of the POLIN Museum. The subject of tonight's discussion is Natan Meir's Stepchildren of the Ghetto, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, the Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe from 1800 to 1939, which was published in 2020. As its title indicates, it's an investigation of the marginal elements in Jewish small-town life in Eastern Europe. Using a large range of sources, among them folklore, memoirs, newspaper articles, and the works of Yiddish writers, Natan has analyzed the presence in such towns of the destitute, the mentally disturbed, and the physically disadvantaged. He discusses how the Jewish elite here sought to deal with these groups through the Hekdesh, the Jewish almshouse and hospice, and charitable provision, as well as through the bizarre phenomenon of the cholera wedding, in which a couple drawn from such groups was used to atone for the sins of the community thought to be responsible for the plague. The book is very remarkable and fascinating, a striking and controversial account of the underside of Jewish life in one of its main foci in Eastern Europe. Let me just briefly describe both Natan Meir, the author, and the two discussants. Natan is the Lorry Lokey Chair in Judaic Studies at Portland State University. He's the author of Kiev, a Jewish Metropolis, a History, 1859 to 1914, which was published in 2010 and which was translated into Ukrainian in 2016. He's the co-author of Anti-Jewish Violence, Rethinking the Pogrom in East European Jewish History, and has also served as a consultant to the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. It'd be interesting to know what is happening there now. His most recent book, of course, the subject of tonight's discussion, is Stepchildren of the Ghetto. The first discussant is Eva Hoffman, who grew up in Krakow before emigrating in her teens to Canada and then the United States. After receiving her PhD in literature from Harvard University, she worked as a senior editor and literary critic at the New York Times and has taught at various British and American universities. At present, she's teaching at University College London. Her books, which have been translated widely, include the remarkable Lost in Translation, Life in a New Language, London 1990, which I'm sure we've all read and which, of course, also was taken as the title by her film, which is a very fine tribute. Exit into History, A Journey Through the New Eastern Europe, The Shtetl, Life and Death of a Small Town and the World of Polish Jews, After Such Knowledge, Memory, History and Legacy of the Holocaust, and Time, Big Ideas and Small Books. She's also the author of two novels, The Secret and Illuminations, and she's really one of the great adornments of London intellectual life, and we're very pleased that she's moved to London. Glenn Dynner, who was my student at Brandeis, is the Bennett Professor at Fairfield University, a new position which he's only just taken up. His work explores the religious and social history of Polish Jewry, and he's the author of Men of Silk, the Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society, published in 2006. This was awarded the Koret Publication Prize. He's also the author of Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor and Life in the Kingdom of Poland, published in 2014. These are, like Eva's book on the Shtetl, works which relate closely to the subject of tonight's discussion. He's been a Fulbright Scholar, a member of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, and a member of the editorial boards of East European Jewish Affairs, the Journal of Jewish Identities, and POLIN Journal of Polish Jewish Studies. At present, he's working on how Hasidism became politicized in early 20th century Poland, and he's preparing a monograph on this topic, tentatively entitled Exile of the Spirit, Hasidism in Interwar and Nazi-occupied Poland. I think that this is a very interesting panel, and I'm sure that everybody will have a lot to say on the topics which we are going to be investigating this evening. I'll ask Natan first to describe what he tried to do in the book, and then to go on, I'll ask the two participants a number of questions which we can then review. So I'll ask Natan to start. You need to unmute, Natan.
Yes, thanks, Antony. Thanks so much for that introduction and for organizing this this panel, this discussion, which I'm very excited about. I previously told the discussants how honored I feel to be discussing my book with them. I think it's probably a sign of the importance of the works, the writings of all of the people present here, that I assign all of their works in my various classes. And in addition to that, of course, very much appreciate the scholarship that they've contributed to the world of East European Jewry. So Antony asked me to talk a little bit about what I set out to do in the book. And I suppose the way I would put that is that I wanted to understand Jewish society in Eastern Europe from the bottom up, through the lens of ordinary people, very ordinary people. Although in some ways the people we're talking about today are actually extraordinary, and I think we'll talk about that some more. But in other words, through the lens not of politics or ideas or religion, although all of those eventually come into play in the book, but through the lives of those who were on the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder. And I think, although I don't know if I would have been able to express this when I first began working on the project, I was interested in not only in history per se, or in social history as I understood it then, but also in mentalities and in cultural discourse and in the symbolism that undergirds Jewish life. So my first book, which as Antony mentioned, was on the Jews of Tsarist Kiev. It was, I think, much more a work of conventional social history. I focused on the leadership of the Jewish community of Kiev, the central institutions of the Jewish community. But I became intrigued by the many thousands of nameless and faceless Jews who were the objects of Jewish charity in Kiev. And charity played a very, very important role. Charity and philanthropy played important roles in the life of the community. And so I thought to myself, what could I possibly learn and say about these people who, about whom we know nothing, at least in my research on Kiev. I really wasn't able to find anything out about them. And it seemed like a worthy challenge, I suppose. So what did I ultimately achieve? Because obviously there's always a gap between your initial goal in a research project and what you're actually able to accomplish. So I think one of the achievements of the book is understanding the cultural role that marginal people, or we can also call them outcasts, played in Jewish Eastern Europe. They played a profoundly ambivalent role. So depending upon the period that we're talking about, upon the context, they could be viewed as linked to the realm of the supernatural in a positive sense, and this regarded with some sense of awe by people around them, or, and this was, I think, more often the case in the period that I'm describing in the book, they might be seen as less than whole people, as less than people, less than human in some way. Emblems of the demonic and the realm of death. So either way, they're not perceived, they're not related to as ordinary people. with larger than ordinary problems and challenges, which is what they were, but they were seen in a kind of in different categories altogether. And so ultimately what the book tries to show, and this is really the core of the thesis, is that the Jewish marginal people came to serve as a kind of symbol for the Jewish people as a whole, or at least the Jewish people in Eastern Europe. And I use the term doppelganger in the book, a doppelganger onto which Jewish society could project its fears and anxieties about the place of Jews in the modern world. And a lot of that connects with Jewish-Christian relations and with anti-Semitism, and I think we'll probably get to talk about that eventually. And so marginal people represented, in some sense, what Jews did not want the outside world to see in Jewish society, what they perceived as being ugly and deformed in the Jewish community. So that's one track in the book. The other one is the actual lives of actual real people, which was much more difficult to do. And I think the reason for that is pretty obvious. It's because the sources that we have don't capture the voices of marginal people. They were usually illiterate themselves, and it's very difficult to find a source that reproduces their voices in a way that is not somehow doesn't transform those voices somehow in a way that I think makes it not really reflective of who those people originally were themselves. So that was very difficult to find, and therefore the lives of those people are not as well reflected in the book as I think I would have liked. And that's just as far as I am concerned as a historian, that's the unfortunate reality of the situation, because the sources do not give us access to their lives. There's some exceptions. I'm thinking, for example, of the chapter about mentally ill people. There's a cache of documents that Glenn knows particularly well. He and I both worked with it. The Gutmacher Kvitlach, the tiny little petitionary notes that were sent to a wonder-working rabbi in the late 19th century by Jews across Eastern Europe, in which they asked for blessings and advice, and they poured out their problems to him. And some of those notes were from family members of people with mental illness. So we do get an intimate look into the lives of those families whose sons or daughters were suffering from mental illness. The petitions were not written by the patients or the people themselves. Once in a while, one of those kvitlach, one of those notes reproduces the voice of the person. So it might say, she tells us, right? Let's say this particular woman, Devora Bas Gittel, tells us that she hears voices at night, and that kind of thing. So that's the very, very rare example of the sources providing us with an insight into what somebody's life was actually like. So that was frustrating to me, I suppose. But as you know, to some extent, I tried to use literature to make up for the gaps in the other sources. And then hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. I think I'm particularly proud, although again, I wasn't really aware of this when I began the project, but it ultimately ended up being an intervention into Jewish disability history. And actually it won a prize from the Disability History Society, which I'm particularly proud of. And for that reason, I had to immerse myself in the literature of disability studies, which I had really no inkling of beforehand. And I continue to be interested in disability history. So that's something that the book has really given me as a gift, I think. The last thing I would say is that there's two historical phenomena that figure very, very largely in the book. And one of those Antony already mentioned. The cholera wedding is one. The other one is the Hektish, the Jewish poorhouse in Eastern Europe. And those two historical phenomena ended up being very useful for me in exploring the role of the Jewish outcasts, because those phenomena they were both present from the early 19th century, persisted well into the 20th century. So in other words, the entire chronological span of the book. And I would say that they helped me define the categories of marginality that I included in the book, which are beggars, including wandering vagrants who moved from town to town in Eastern Europe, people with physical and mental disabilities, including people with developmental and cognitive disabilities, and poor orphans. And all of those people, they were associated with, all these categories are associated with, of course, with poverty, with kind of lack of access to livelihood, but also with associated with shame and with being perceived as other, and in some way also as freaks of society. And that kind of categorization helped me also exclude the categories that were not organically part of this this discussion. And often people would ask me as I was working on the book, how is your book on criminals going? Because they often associate marginality with criminals, which is true to a certain extent, certainly from a sociological perspective. But actually, there was very little discussion of criminality and prostitution, for example, in the book, and mostly because those categories were not associated with the same characteristics that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Certainly, when we talk about the Hektish, the poorhouse, and the cholera wedding, we don't see criminals and prostitutes and people of the underworld usually associated with those two institutions. But that's, of course, something we can also get into in more detail later on. So I'll stop there, and we can move on to the questions.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very clear account. At one level, this is about the way in which in pre-modern times, people attempted to deal with marginal figures, the poor, the mentally ill, the disabled. The 19th century saw the emergence of new institutions in large towns which attempted to deal with these in a different manner. How successfully, one could argue. Well, this is really what struck me hearing you describe this. But let me now move to the questions which I want to pose to the two discussants. And the first one I'll pose in the first case to Eva, which is, this is a very striking account of Shtetl life, but it goes against the very sentimentalized view of Shtetl life, which is best embodied in Fiddler on the Roof. How does this account of Shtetl life alter our traditional view of what happened in these Jewish small towns? Eva.
Well, I must say it was, revelatory to me to read this book. I mean, I was not aware of, of this existence of these people who are, in a sense, I think, victims of double discrimination. They were victims of Jewish discrimination. I mean, I think the more respectable Jews were probably ashamed of them, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, there were the Poles. So they were the true underclass. And it is a very revealing and a very upsetting picture. I have some, I don't know if I should, bundle my questions or my comments.
Yes, please.
Perhaps I should. In a way, I wonder, what percentage of Jewish society they represented. Were they a small percentage? I mean, the pictures of, particular people who are mentally ill, who are, disabled, were put in these poor houses is very upsetting. And I wonder, how much of Jewish society they represented. And, were the more respectable Jews ashamed of them? Or did they treat them well? So there is that question. At some point, there was just one moment when I disagreed. You said something about, the condition being a liminal state between, between man and God. But it seems to me that it was their ultimate vulnerability, which brought them, perhaps closer to God. So there is all of that. In a way, I wonder how much, this differed from other societies. From, Victorian English society. Perhaps it did, in the particular institutions of the Hekdesh and this very strange magical ritual of the color wedding. So there was all of that. I'm sorry, I don't remember what they actually said.
No.
You don't mention the problem of drunkenness, which I think was a widely sort of discussed problem among Jewish societies. After all, the Jews ran the inns very often, and they were accused of making the peasants drunk. So there was, there was that. Also, the problem of sort of transgression and liminality at upper levels. I'm thinking of books of Jacob and, the very strange rituals and the very strange sexual customs that the Frankists had. How did that relate to all of this? And also, did I just ask this, were non-Jewish, I'm particularly interested in this business of the Frankists, because it was, in a way, deviation at a higher level and at a higher level of wealth. And also, did I just say this, were the non-Jewish Poles aware of this? And also, what were, for example, what were the sources of better income and better living for Jews, for poor Jews in Poland? Some of them ran estates of nobles. So did they take care of, or were they very ashamed of these, Jewish brethren? I think that's all that I.
No, thank you. Well, I'll ask Glenn to respond to this question. Eva talked about drunkenness. Glenn, of course, is the author of a book on the Jewish tavern. But how does this account of Shtetl life alter our traditional understanding?
Well, thanks so much. It's such an honor to be here. I think the book is absolutely transformative. I don't say that lightly. It could have just been an expose where you just, draw attention to the worst aspects of Shtetl life, the poor, the destitute, the mentally ill, and leave it at that. But Natan shows himself to be such a subtle historian that he brings out, I would say, rather than a nightmare kind of a context, he brings out ambivalence. There's nothing wholly bad or good about anything here. The Hekdesh, for example, is the poorhouse, which is obviously a horrible place the way it's being described in the sources that he brings. And yet it's also somewhat well-meaning. it's corrupted, yet there's generosity and piety involved in the poorhouse. And it's not necessarily easily displaced by the hospital, the institution, other modern facilities. There's something lost as well that Natan shows so well, that genuine sense of Jewish giving, of Jewish charity, gets somehow made anonymous, in these new institutions. I thought that was just brilliant. But most brilliant of all, to my mind, is really showing how the marginal are not really marginal. They're reflective of the whole, whether it be reflective of how people in power respond to those who are powerless. What does it say about them? But also how non-Jewish society kind of looks upon the rest of Jewish society through the marginalized. This anxiety that they will do so, that will only, like the Jews will only be seen as beggars, and the mentally ill, and so on, the disabled, and yet you have Jewish artists and writers who are basically saying that themselves, that this is us. This is us. If I could just show real quickly, what this reminded me of is the artist Iskar Ribak, who really seems to say the same thing through his artwork, where everyone is seen as somehow, if you can use the word, deformed or physically disabled. Even everyday people in the marketplace, Hasidic Jews. This man with a goat, I think, is the actual title of this, who looks like he has a spinal deformity, which is, I think, the official term for hunchback or humpback. And this brings me to one thing that I thought could have been drawn out a lot more in the book, and that is trauma, post-pogrom and other kinds of violence against Jews. The trauma, not just of, the trauma of being physically victimized in terms of violence, but also sexual violence. It would be interesting to expand the study into a look, especially where we have the best records, which is the 1919 pogroms, where we have interviews by medical professionals. Irina Ataskevich has studied these, Elisa Ben-Parad and Jeff Weidlinger. It'd be interesting now, these are very recent works, so I'm not casting any blame at all, but it would be now interesting to look at how violence and physical trauma affect this mental state of the Shtetl inhabitant, because what's a little bit unclear in the book is how much reality is there here, and how much is just a projection, right? And how much is just an image. I have a feeling that surviving a pogrom would be very mentally disabling for just about anybody. Even if it didn't affect you directly, and it affects somebody in your family or your community or even a distant community, it's something we have to consider, that there was reality to this, this sense that all of Jewish society is somehow disabled. It's being, as you show, it's being exploited by Zionist ideology to dismiss the entire diaspora existence. And obviously that's problematic to do, but there may have been more of a grain of truth to these depictions of the entire Shtetl as somehow being, representing disability, not through fault of their own, but through persecution, through discrimination, official discrimination, and that kind of thing. So it would be interesting to draw out the story in that direction. But I do want to draw attention to one last thing, and that's the methodology. I think of this generation, and I'm counting Natan and myself in this generation, I think what we've benefited from is the new accessibility of the archives. But some of us, Natan, of course, included. We can also talk about Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, Eli Shankar, Rachel Manikin. Now, some of us were not content to just go and mine these archives that had just become accessible. We then took what we found and we tried to integrate this material with other kinds of sources like memoirs and literature. And in both of our case, the Gutmacher Kvittlich, these petitions to a miracle worker, and you get a much fuller picture. And I think that may be why, we have this kind of picture of ambivalence, because it's simply so much more complex and nuanced. And we get beyond, I hope I'm not being unfair here, but there is a certain empirical shallowness to older works like those of Levitats, for example, which are listing all these data and statistics, but you're bringing us into real people and real people's lives, and you're not afraid to bring in fiction and other works of literature as well. So that's what I really think is so transformative.
Well, that actually brings me to the next question, which is that the book draws heavily on literary sources, above all the works of Mendele Mocha Sefarim, Peretz, Sholom Aleichem, Shimon Ansky, and Isaac Bashevis Singer. What are the advantages and the problems in doing this? Before I ask Eva to respond, I'd just like to add a footnote, which is about the traumatic impact of pogroms. The South African Jewish community was actually a community which felt very strongly its obligation to assist Jews in Europe. And after 1918, they sent a group to Europe to bring out pogrom orphans to South Africa. They assumed that these pogrom orphans would be wonderful members of the community, that this was, as they thought, wonderful raw material which could be transformed into bourgeois, in a bourgeois manner, and play an obviously positive role in South African Jewish life. As we all know, well, not all know, but in the South African context, this went horribly wrong. The children who were brought out in this way, often 4, 5, 6, had seen terrible things and turned out to be very problematic. And this has been described by a number of people in South Africa. It's one of the interesting examples of how people didn't understand what trauma meant and how it actually impacted people. Well, let's move back to the question of the literary sources. Eva, Glenn praised this. How do you see the use of literary sources in this book?
Well, I see it as, as very legitimate. I think, they add something to our understanding. And I'm sorry if I can't say, much more, but, certainly people like Isaac Bashevis Singer, bring these problems, fully to life. The way that, perhaps pure research doesn't always do. Certainly, Appelfeld, with his sense that it was Yiddish culture in Poland, particularly in Eastern Europe, which was the real Yiddish culture, is very informative. So, so I think, it is very good to have literary sources aside from, sort of pure scholarly research.
Glenn, do you want to add to that? You already said something on this.
Yes, I'd like to add that, the problem with literature is great authors love hyperbole, often humorous hyperbole, right? So what do we do with that? How literal can we take all this? But I think we'd be naive to buy into this notion that archival documents are somehow less prone to hyperbole, or the works of social reformers. They're also employing hyperbole. And what's happening in this book, which I think is a model for the use of literature in history because of this, is a kind of seamless integration and cross-pollinization between literary sources with the archival and other kinds of sources. And, as a result, we have these incredible insights in here by these great authors that are now being contextualized. So I would say this: if we were going to try to somehow make rules of the game, using literature as a single solitary proof text is definitely problematic. But if it's measured against other kinds of sources and perhaps triangulated or whatever metaphor you want to use, then we have a legitimate use. And this is what I would give to students to see how we can use literature, as history. Even if there are fictional personas, they're still capturing a really deep insight about society. I want to draw attention just briefly to two episodes where I was kind of blown away. The first one was somebody I know extremely well, is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav and his Seven Beggars, the tale of the Seven Beggars. I've never seen successfully contextualized before, and that's what happens here, where it allows Natan to bring out a really, really important insight here, which is not everybody looked at beggars in this case in a completely negative light. And Nachman of Bratslav is basically saying you can be blind and have incredible sight, right? Incredible insight, and so on and so forth. That the supposedly marginal are actually containers of great wisdom and insight. And that's a theme running through this work. On the other moment, of course, is Mendele. And Mendele's descriptions are absolutely priceless. What a waste it would be not to use these, because he ends up also hitting upon something when he has the local residents of the poorhouse, I think it is, the Hekdesh, responding to the government's attempt to replace that institution with a more anonymous and professional institution, whether it's the hospital or the asylum. And they're saying basically, well, what's going to happen to Jewishness itself? If we can no longer have a direct relationship between, the charitable person and the receiver of charity. So they bring this insight in, and that happens within the literature. And then Natan shows how actually, yes, this was really a problem. It's not so simple as institutionalizing all these and modernizing all these institutions. Something is lost as well. So I really think this is a model, if I didn't make that clear enough.
Well, thank you. I know that Natan wants to respond, so I'll ask him to do so. But before, we can't see our audience, but we hope that there is a large audience out there. And if you want to put questions to the panelists or to Natan himself, please do so through the chat facility, and I'll then be able to put the questions to the group subsequently. So Natan, I'll let you respond to the remarks of Eva and Glenn.
Sure. Thank you both for those comments and the praise. I mean, to hear from both of you words like revelatory and transformative. It's very high praise coming from both of you. So I appreciate that a great deal. Briefly about the question about Shtetl life, and I want to point out that although the book is entitled Stepchildren of the Shtetl, and there is an important focus on Jewish small town life in the book, there's also episodes that focus on the big city as well.
Yes, I should have said that.
Yeah, I mean, it's any editor will tell you that Shtetl in the title is a good way to market the book, and so I suppose that's part of the strategy. But for sure, there's a lot on the Shtetl here. And Eva, you asked what percentage of Jewish society these outcasts represented. And I think generally I don't have really any statistics, although here and there we can find statistics depending on the period that we're looking at that might even put the percentage of beggars, let's say, at or the very, very poor, to put it broadly, at something close to 9 or 10%, which seems like a very, very large percentage. But Jewish society in Eastern Europe in the 19th century was very impoverished to begin with. So it's probably not that surprising that we have people who were the indigent, who made up a large proportion of society. It's hard to tell when we come to categories like disability, mental illness, because we don't have good statistics from this period for the most part. And whatever small percentage we're talking about, whether it's 2%, 3%, I think it's an important corollary to that is the extent to which such people were visible in society. And I think that relates to your question about shame. And you asked if more respectable Jews were ashamed of these outcasts. And I think it's safe to say, at least my evidence seems to suggest that most people were ashamed of them. And that was intimately tied up with the fact that such people tended to be visible, because madmen, quote unquote, right, or town fools, as sometimes they were known, tended to wander around in the marketplace or in the center of the Shtetl. And in the big cities, once Jews started migrating to those big cities, we have accounts in Jewish newspapers of people openly worried about the impact on the image of Jewish society of Jewish madmen and madwomen wandering around, of many Jewish beggars wandering the streets of Odessa, for example, comes to mind, of Jewish urchins, right? So little Jewish orphans who had nowhere to live, homeless or orphans wandering the streets, begging. It just, of course, there was also a genuine concern for their well-being that you can find in some of these pronouncements, but at the same time, a sense of shame and concern that this will reflect very poorly on Jewish society as a whole, both because these people embody some of the anti-Semitic stereotypes that are very widespread in Eastern Europe, and I think in Europe as a whole, and also because the fact that such people are wandering the streets seemingly without any kind of care, that also reflects poorly on Jewish charitable institutions, right? Because they're apparently unable to take care of these people who really need the most care of anyone. So that was definitely present in many of the sources that I looked at. And Eva, you also mentioned the links between transgression and liminality and sexuality in the context specifically of the Frankists. And I think that those did actually come out in certain places in my research, albeit between the lines, I think. But there are suggestions in the historical documents as well as in the literature that these outcasts, wandering beggars, for example, who are the focus of Mendele Mocher-Sforim's book, his novel Fishka the Lame, Fishka der Krumer, there's a suggestion that they are sexually licentious in some way. And that also appears in some of the documents on the cholera wedding too. I think one of the reasons that the cholera bride and the cholera groom are going to be brought together in the cholera wedding is to end this state of bachelorhood, as it were, or sexual in-betweenness that they've been living in, because the outcasts generally did not get married, right? And they were the only people, or among the only people in the Jewish community who were not married, because in Eastern Europe, of course, that was the default state of existence, was to be married relatively young. And I also want to respond to what Glenn said about the trauma of physical and sexual violence, especially after the genocidal level massacres of 1919 to 1921. And you said it's unclear how much, to some extent, how much is reality and how much is projection. And I think you're right. I think that there is that flaw in the last chapter, because I essentially kind of telescoped and what could have been an entire book on Jewish society and Jewish outcasts in interwar Poland, not to mention the interwar Soviet Union, into one chapter, which was, as you can imagine, that was a challenging task. It was somewhat frustrating. I had a lot of documentation from research that I did at the Joint, in the Joint archives, that I just somehow was not able to find a place for in that chapter. So it ended up being more about cultural and literary and folkloristic depictions, and so much of the social history did not make it into that chapter, which of course that's a limitation for sure. And I think that leads to, that explains some of your critique, which I absolutely take on board. Wouldn't it be nice? I was going to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could rewrite our books later on? Of course, some people who are able to put out their books in later editions can do that. And also, Antony mentioned earlier that my first book came out in the Ukrainian translation, and I'm working with my colleagues in Kiev right now to so that they can put out both a Russian and Ukrainian language translation of this book. And I suppose that, you know, when that happens, I can work all of these corrections or critiques into the manuscript if possible. But Glenn, I really appreciate your comments on my methodology and the way that I use sources and literature, because that really is exactly what I was trying to do, trying to contextualize the literature. I'll point to two sources of this for me, two inspirations. One, I think, because you mentioned everything is quite ambivalent in the book. It's not an expose, right? You said it's not dark and light. It's always ambivalent. And I'd say I gain in large measure from Michael Stanislavski, who was my dissertation advisor, because he taught me about ambivalence. And the other thing is that I was lucky enough to be a fellow at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, for a year while I was writing this book. And because it's a fellowship for both scholars and writers, meaning poets and nonfiction writers, I think I was really inspired to spend a lot more time with literature than I might have otherwise. And I think that explains why I gave it so much attention. And I'm just really, really happy that you said that there is this integration, this seamless integration, you said, of literary works and other sources, because that's exactly what I was shooting for. Because in my first book, I think I used literary sources a little bit more naively. I used them as kind of a mimetic reflection of what life in Kiev was like at the time. And I would like to think that I was a little bit more sophisticated in my approach to literary sources this time around. So thanks for that.
Well, Eva, do you want to say something?
Can I just ask an additional question? I don't know how relevant it is, but I wonder to what extent these outcasts, the stepchildren of the Shtetl, observed the rituals of the religious rituals of Jewish life, Yom Kippur, Passover. And would those be moments of solidarity with, better off Jews? Would they be invited, to the, let's say, wealthier Jewish homes, for example?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I think generally it's safe to say that they did observe Judaism in the same way that that most Jews did, but there were probably some exceptions. There's a few things that are coming to mind. I'll note briefly that there was another category that I considered including in this book early on and then didn't, and those are the Yeshuvnikis, or the rural Jews who lived in villages, who usually lived just one or two Jewish families to a settlement. They did not regularly have access to a minyan, so they were often looked upon as ignorant, as boors by Shtetl Jews or by city Jews, because they were not able to observe Judaism in the same way. Because if you don't have access to a minyan on a regular basis, then your observance is going to be different. So there's another category, albeit different from the ones I was talking about in the book, that actually did have a certain kind of different religious observance. The marginal Jews were sometimes grouped together with the religiously lax, and that's something that I discussed when I talk about the conscription under Nicholas I that started in 1827, when there were Jewish communities, for example, in Minsk, that deliberately tried to conscript people who fit into these categories that we're talking about here, whether they were vagrants, these were people who owed the community back taxes, and they would never have been able to pay. They were seen as a burden on the community, and also the religiously lax were sometimes included as well. So it's possible that these marginal people were perceived as being also religiously other, although we know that, and to your question about whether or not they were invited to people's homes, the tradition in the Jewish community in Eastern Europe was that these people were invited for Friday night dinner and for lunch after services on the Sabbath morning. That was widely understood. That was kind of, if you were a beggar, you knew that you could get 2 good meals on the Sabbath. You just had to go to the synagogue, and then there was a kind of a ritual in which you were placed with a family. Now, earlier on, I would say in the early modern period, those people were also placed overnight to be lodged with those, usually with those more prosperous families. And one of the transitions that I try to describe in the book is that it seems that disappeared, and those people were forced to stay in the poorhouse in the Hekdesh. They were still often given meals at people's homes, but the expectation they would be able to stay the night, that seemed to disappear, to fade away. And I think that was precisely because they were viewed more and more as somehow shameful and as dirty, and people just didn't want them to stay in their homes.
This was a first stage in the further institutionalization of a charity, which you also described. Let me move on to the next question. You've spoken already, and so has Glenn, about the cholera wedding. There's a very striking description in the book of a cholera wedding. And of course, this is an institution in which a couple drawn from marginal groups in the Shtetl was used to atone for the sins of the community thought to be responsible for the plague. Where does this phenomenon fit into our understanding of Jewish religious life in Poland? Eva talked about Frankism. How far has this understanding been modified by our experience of the COVID pandemic, where we've seen what an epidemic actually means in social disruptive terms? Eva, do you want to start?
Gosh. Was it more disruptive of Jewish life in Poland than of any other life? I'm just not sure, I mean, I know that Israel had a very big
So let me ask Glenn first, and you can comment on what Glenn has to say.
Sorry?
Okay. If I may, so look, I think it's really a surreal experience to be reading this after what we've just gone through. And I'm afraid of sounding like Fox News, but there were things that we did during COVID which were not so rational. If you remember wiping down your mail and things like this, we're trying to gain control over a terrifying situation, and you run up against the limits of science and of medical research. And we saw incredible achievements in terms of vaccines and so on. We also saw incredible failures. And I think this relates back to Natan's book, which is what do you do about the tension between a modernizing society that where scientists are the gods, so to speak, and a community like ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn who see, and it's not just Jews, of course, any religious group that sees communal prayer as absolutely essential to battling these kinds of epidemics and pandemics. The way they were spoken to from above, so to speak, I think did a lot of harm rather than good. Even if maybe, the scientists, the doctors were right, they didn't say it in a way that took into account the feelings of religious people, very pious and spiritually minded people. So I guess reading this in hindsight is, okay, yes, it's strange to think that by marrying off a couple of destitute people, you'll somehow ward off the plague. But a lot of things we did were not so perfect either. And I think what the lesson is we need to learn a way in which we can better communicate with people who don't share our worldview and who maybe have a much more traditionalist worldview. And, that makes the whole phenomenon of the cholera wedding look less bizarre once we realize that, people will resort to magic and mysticism in order to try to gain control over nature in a terrifying situation.
Eva, yes.
Can I just add, now that you have said this, that the same was true of Muslim communities. I mean, they were extremely resistant to vaccination. I mean, I don't know how it goes against the idea of belief, I mean, I suppose the idea of belief is that God will take care of you, and why put something, strange and unknown in your body. But there was enormous resistance among, in fact, the most vulnerable groups to vaccination.
Well, this is linked with the problem of the old forms of charity, which are linked with religion and linked with personal giving, and the institutionalization of charity and medicalization of the treatment of illness. Once you have doctors, their view of the world is very different from the view of traditional faith healers. And I think that this is something which we see happening throughout the 19th century. I think this is really the theme of François Guéné's book on Polnische Judentum, about how modern forms of charity have many beneficial results. I mean, but Glenn pointed out that they don't have all the answers, and in certain circumstances, they also alienate people to whom they're actually directed. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question, which is one of the bigger questions. What does the book tell us about relations between Jews and non-Jews in the Shtetl and perhaps in towns? And in this context, we were talking about how people who are mentally disturbed are supposed to be closer to God. In Orthodox Europe, the Eurodivi, the holy fool, was a very accepted phenomenon. To what extent was the same idea part of the Jewish world? Eva, do you want to comment on this?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can comment usefully. I mean, I imagine, that the Polish society was particularly horrified by, these people who were outcasts, and who were ill and who resorted to magic. But honestly, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know that there was perhaps I've already said it, there was quite a bit of competition really between peasants and, Polish peasants and Jews. And, the Polish peasants often felt that the Jews were better off, and, that they were treated better than they were. So there was that, there was the relationship, oddly enough, a relationship of envy. Yeah. But other than that, I don't know. Yeah.
Glenn.
What I would add is you see that cultural is a permeable membrane, that Jews are living separately to a large extent, especially in these small market towns. There's no doubt about that, but there's these points of convergence and mutual influence, to the point where Natan at one point suggests that it actually may have been, if I'm reading this correctly, it may have been Jewish society that pioneered the mental institution, and at least foreshadowed it. And so it's not so clear cut that Jews are simply learning from, non-Jewish society and imitating it. I think these groups of destitute can be quite different, though, because in my own research, I found that really widespread drunkenness was much more a problem in non-Jewish society. And evidence of that is the temperance societies that emerged, and sermons in like Catholic churches, for example, would emphasize drunkenness. You don't find that in Jewish society, to the same extent. The one thing maybe I would say is a bit lacking, or you go too easy in this book, Natan, is the role of the government itself in creating the situation where Jews are at such an economic disadvantage, all kinds of disabilities. Much of this book takes place before emancipation, And but even after emancipation, there's plenty of discrimination, economically and otherwise. And the effects of not being willing or able to protect your Jewish population. I think you could have been a lot tougher on the non-Jewish authorities for this predicament, because after all, Jewish society is kind of left to its own devices to try to take care of its own destitute. And so we're trying very hard to get beyond this kind of black and white depiction of Polish-Jewish relations where it's mutual hostility. I get that, but I don't want to go too far and alleviate the state of its role in creating that situation of destitution. But what I would say, the Holy Fool, which is what Antony began with, it's so interesting that you see this as an actual later phenomenon. I found additional examples, like, for example, the brothers Reb Zusha Vanapol and Elimelech Lezhais. Zusha also represents this kind of holy fool, but that's just to add to the examples. And again, this is late. And it seems like what my suspicion is, what I've written about in the past, is Hasidism is a kind of acculturation. It's a defensive acculturation, to be sure, a selective acculturation. You've just provided us with another really great example of how Hasidic society is as much an acculturation as it is a insular movement of traditionalism. And so I thought that was fascinating as well. But by and large, I think not necessarily an innovation, but sort of a continuation of the new historiographical trend is to really view these cultures as porous and mutual influencing. And that's really what I got so much out of this book.
Actually, this reflects one of the questions which has been asked by the audience, which is, how did the treatment of the Jewish destitute, disabled, or mad compare to non-Jewish people with the same problems?
Yes,
Eva,
thanks.
Eva, do you want to comment first on that?
Okay.
Eva,
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Gosh, could you please repeat the question? I didn't really.
How did the treatment of the Jewish destitute, disabled, or mad compare to non-Jewish people with the same problems?
I imagine they were not vastly different. I mean, I suppose the Jewish disabled were taken care of by Jewish institutions.
Yes.
Rather than Polish institutions. And I'm not sure I'm in a position to comment on how the Polish institutions, differed from the Jewish institutions. I mean, certainly, perhaps, the sort of the psychological approach came in earlier into Polish society than into Jewish society, and the whole business of, therapy and, psychiatry and all of that. I think, perhaps, the Jews were perhaps initially more resistant to this, although, of course, we have a grand tradition of, of Jewish psychiatrists, of Jewish psychiatry. And by the way, just on the problem of drunkenness, I didn't mean that the Jews were drunk. I think the Jews were blamed for spreading drunkenness to Poles and for running, in fact, I think, I've read accounts in which, the Jews had these inns and they themselves didn't get drunk, but they made others drunk. So, yeah.
There was a strong taboo in Jewish life against drunkenness, but obviously it was also a Jewish problem, I think. Natan, would you like to say something about how widespread Jewish drunkenness was?
I think I would probably defer to the expert on alcohol here, which
Glenn.
is Glenn. But I will say that to the extent that drunkenness is let's say, a stereotypical characteristic of Gentile society at the time, I think there was some of that to be seen in Jewish society as well, as Glenn has pointed out in his own research, and that's true of other aspects. To get back to what Glenn said a little while ago about the porousness of the boundary between the two communities, is that I think the widespread view of Jewish society in Eastern Europe is that it was kind of hermetically walled off from Christian society, which was not at all the case. And there is actually a lot of boundary crossing in many ways. Although, of course, it's also true that there were kind of specific cultural and social characteristics that, for historical reasons, tended to be associated with one or the other community. But Antony, if I may, I'd like to go back to your original question about the extent to which, or actually it was a question from the audience, I think, about how Jewish marginal people were treated vis-a-vis how such people might be treated in Christian society, meaning kind of the Christian equivalent. And I think, and this is what I often say to audiences when I lecture, and I often get that kind of question, and I say, you wouldn't have wanted to be an outcast in either Christian or Jewish society a century and a half ago, but if you had to be, it probably would have chosen to be a Jewish outcast, despite all the things that I say in the book, because there were institutions to take care of such people. They didn't always work properly, and obviously there's this whole question of perception that we've been talking about, but I think you'd be just statistically more likely to be cared for if you were a Jewish outcast, because in Christian society, especially in the world of the Russian peasant or the Polish peasant, life was difficult anyway to begin with. And so if you had a disability of some kind, it would have been that much more difficult to find any kind of support or succor within your community, within your society. And Jews were, in fact, in some ways ahead of the ball in terms of medical care, because Jews were known for setting up very, very effective and successful hospitals throughout Eastern Europe. And that included often specific wards in those hospitals to care for the mentally ill. So that in and of itself was something for which Jews were known. And again, despite all of the drawbacks that I describe in the book. So I think it is important to view this in perspective. And it's interesting because talking about the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, I really appreciate that question, Antony, because it forced me to go back to the book and think about to what extent did I actually discuss this in the work. And Glenn himself just pointed out that I could have said more about the role of the non-Jewish authorities in creating these circumstances that Jews found themselves in that often made the lives of the Jewish marginals that much more difficult. And I think that's certainly true. It struck me that the way that the Gentile society or Christian society appears in the book is more often not as actual people or institutions, but as a kind of specter haunting Jewish consciousness, which is to say that the non-Jew, I should be more specific, the Christian in this book, rather than really figuring as a historical actor, because the book really does focus on the inner workings of Jewish society, because that's just more interesting to me and we tend to focus on what interests us. And that Christian really appears more often as I think the imagined Christian, who a Jew might hear in the back of his or her mind asking, who is that Jewish beggar on the street? Why is he lying there? And what is your relationship to him? And isn't that beggar actually you, right? And that was the kind of anti-Semitic perception that I think actually did influence Jews' perceptions of themselves. And that's certainly true not only for Jews as a minority, but for any racial or ethnic minority in a given society when they know that there are certain prejudicial perceptions of them, and they have to kind of work that out in relationship to those people who are kind of at the outcasts of their own.
I'm going to, time is running out, so I want to ask, we have one further question from our audience, from Joseph Gilbert, and it's a question which we've partly dealt with in the past, the question of how the better off Jews and non-Jews perceived the marginalized. And he comments, this was exploited in the film Jesus, Jews invading German territory. So how far did both the better off Jews and non-Jews see the Jewish marginal elements as something which needed to be dealt with because otherwise they would become a threat or would undermine the position of the better off Jews? Glenn, do you want to answer this first, and then I'll ask Eva to.
Look, all I can talk about is what Natan wrote about, which is a deep anxiety, among you call it the better off members of society. They're looking over their shoulders. They're worried how this is making them look too. And of course, at one point, Natan points out that, there but for the grace of God go I, that this could be me one day too. So there's a deep psychological dimension to all of this as well. There's guilt, there's denial. I think it's all, telling us, which is, I think Natan's point in the very beginning is everybody here is human. And this is how human beings behave. And our point is to try to understand that better. Just a quick word about the last question. That was non-Jewish institutions. I think a lot of research remains to be done on this. And I wanted to point out that a doctoral student at Yale University, working with Marcy Shore, named Karolina Kolpak, is working on this exact issue where she's focusing on these sanatoria, these kind of summer camps for orphans and other destitute children, both among Jews and non-Jews. They were kept separate, but they were kind of sponsored by the same individuals. So I just wanted to point out that a lot of this research is ongoing, and it's very important.
Eva.
How did the better off Jews view the less better off Jews? Well, I think there was often an element of shame. It is hard to generalize without doing very deep research. But I think, the Jews who ran the sort of the princely estates probably wouldn't have wanted to come too close to the poor Jews. At the same time, I do think, there were these charitable institutions. There was an incorporation into the Jewish society. There was the sense, that these are ours, oni są nasi, these are ours. So, yeah.
Well, I think that this is, we have many more questions we could discuss. I'd like to go on all evening, but time is coming to an end. I'll ask Natan to say a few final words about how he sees the discussion and where his research should be going, or where the research which he's started to undertake, where it should be going now. Natan.
Thank you, Antony. Well, I want to thank Eva and Glenn for their insights. I really appreciate that. And I guess I'll say, just to close, with particular reference to the cholera wedding, but actually it's a larger comment about this entire field that I've tried to begin opening up. The cholera wedding, you asked, how does it fit into our understanding of Jewish life in Poland? And I think it very much enriches it, even though many people who learn about it are horrified by the description of the wedding, and they feel that it's exploitative of these marginal people, which it was. But we also know much more because of the collar wedding about the very, very rich and the very persistent role of magic in Jewish life, which continued certainly through the interwar period and actually into the period of the Holocaust. And in fact, there was a COVID-19 wedding in Bnei Brak in April of 2020. So we know that undercurrent in Jewish society is still very much present, or at least to some extent, it's still present. And I think opening up the ritual of the cholera wedding and learning what we can from it about Jewish society as a whole is emblematic of what I'm trying to do in this book, which is to explore those sides of Jewish life that we did not know about before. As Eva said in her opening comments, that she learned things that she had not been aware of, which to me is very high praise coming from someone who wrote one of our most important books about the Shtetl. And I think that to the extent that I did that using, for example, the tool of disability studies, I see that now continuing with others in the Jewish community. Disability studies is now becoming an important line of exploration, a line of study in Jewish studies as it is in other fields, and I think that's appropriate, and it's going to help us understand this society much more broadly and in a much more rich way than we ever did before. So I'm looking forward to those kinds of interventions, similarly to the one that Glenn mentioned a few minutes ago, the scholar who's working at Yale, the graduate student at Yale who's working on understanding the attitudes towards Jews of non-Jewish institutions. There's tremendous work happening. By the way, I should point out, because we are on the POLIN, the YouTube channel of the POLIN Museum, a lot of this research is happening in Poland now, which is very, very exciting. So there's a lot more to look forward to.
Well, I'd like, on behalf of the audience and myself, to thank firstly Natan for this participating in this discussion, to Eva and Glenn for their involvement. I'd also like to thank the technical staff who facilitated the discussion. It all went very smoothly. Jan Wozniakowski, Magdalena Lasocka, and Pavel Rudzki in particular, and other members of the technical staff at Warwick University. For those, I hope that we had a large audience this evening, but for those who weren't able to see it this evening, this discussion will be available on the YouTube channel of the Polin Museum. I think it's an important discussion. I think this is a very important book. I appeal to everybody to purchase it, those who haven't already done so, and to read it. It certainly advances in a very significant way our understanding of many aspects of Jewish life, and it portrays them in a manner which is neither stereotypical nor paternalistic, and that's, I think, very important. And on that note, I'd like again to thank Natan for his contribution, and Eva and Glenn for their participation this evening. And I wish everybody a happy new year in 2 weeks' time, and that we'll be able to continue these discussions. Thank you.